Welcome to today's Explainer. I'm so glad you're here because we are going to dive into something pretty amazing today. We're exploring how a single, incredibly powerful concept manages to connect completely different worlds. We're breaking down a fundamental mechanism that you have absolutely seen, used, or literally performed yourself, probably without even realizing how universal it actually is. It's all about the pivot, and we're going to explain the pivot with some captivating visuals to really bring this to life. Let's jump right in. Think about this for a second. What does a star basketball player, a massive, sprawling farm, and a fast-paced tech startup all have in common? I mean, on the surface, absolutely nothing, right? Physical movement, industrial agriculture, and business strategy feel like completely separate disciplines. But they are all bound together by one essential core action: the pivot. Here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at the physical pivot. Then, we'll shift into pivoting data and math, followed by strategic startup pivots. And finally, we'll wrap up with anticipating financial pivot points. Starting off with Section 1, the physical pivot, anchoring to the ground. You know, if you really want to understand a concept, you've got to look at its rules. Take the strict biomechanical rules of a basketball pivot. A player can move one foot around as much as they want, right? But the other foot, the pivot foot, has to remain completely glued to the ground. You literally have to keep that foot planted until you shoot, pass, or dribble, and you can't hold the ball for more than 5 seconds. Once you plant that foot, no switching allowed. You rotate on the ball of the foot, absolutely no sideways sliding, keeping your weight back on your heels for balance. So why are the rules so strict? Well, because anchoring that one foot gives the player a low, incredibly balanced, and powerful position. It creates a fixed point of stability to protect the ball, all while allowing the rest of the body to aggressively attack, look for a pass, or adapt to a defender. Now, what's genuinely fascinating is seeing how that exact same physical mechanism scales up to massive industrial agriculture. Think about a massive irrigation boom rotating around a single, fixed central pivot point. The mathematical challenge here is crazy. The outside radius of that pivot has to cover a vast amount of ground in the exact same time it takes the inside radius to barely inch forward. So to get completely even water coverage across the whole field, the system actually has to apply water at a much, much higher rate at the outer edges than at the center. If it doesn't balance this perfectly, the application rate will exceed the soil's intake rate, and you just get puddling and runoff. The fixed center anchors the entire operation, but all those moving parts have to adapt their speed and output based entirely on how far away they are from that anchor. Moving right along to Section 2, pivoting data and math, anchoring the numbers. Let's transition from the dirt into the digital realm. Okay, before we jump into spreadsheets, we need to talk about the underlying math. In numerical linear algebra, algorithms like Gaussian elimination rely heavily on something called a pivot element. It's basically the first non-zero element in a matrix or array that an algorithm specifically selects to do its calculations. It is exactly like the basketball player's planted foot. The algorithm locks onto this fixed numerical point, usually hunting for the element with the largest absolute value, and uses it as an anchor to swap rows or columns around it. Does doing this add computational cost? Sure, absolutely. But it is entirely worthwhile because it adds crucial numerical stability to the final result, which stops rounding errors from completely ruining the calculation. And this perfectly illustrates how that abstract math translates into the software we use all the time, the pivot table. Imagine raw, chaotic, tabular source data. It's massive and totally unreadable. But then you use a pivot table and instantly transform it into an aggregated, beautifully organized summary. You're isolating specific variables to answer ad hoc questions without having to write any complex formulas. And honestly, the best part? The pivot table operates completely independently. You can rearrange rows and columns into endless different views with zero disturbance to your original source data. Your raw data is the planted foot, and the pivot table is just you rotating around it to find the absolute best angle. Real quick, before we talk business strategy, I just have to drop this fascinating piece of trivia. Between 1994 and 2020, even though the term pivot table felt totally generic for data analysis, kind of like saying spreadsheet, Microsoft actually held a literal trademark on the term in the United States. Wild, right? All right, Section 3, strategic startup pivots, anchoring the vision. So here's a question. If a physical pivot protects a basketball, and a data pivot organizes a spreadsheet without ruining the original file, how does a pivot protect a startup's business model? Well, in the lean startup methodology, a pivot isn't just some random panic move when things go south. It's a structured, deliberate change to a business model when something just isn't working. And crucially, it's rooted in validated learning. Remember our basketball player keeping one foot planted? A startup does the exact same thing. You keep one foot firmly rooted in what you have successfully learned from your customers, and you shift another part of the business model to find a better path forward. It's a discipline change. It's definitely not a blind leap into the unknown. Let's quickly dive into the lean startup pivot taxonomy to see this in action. Notice how every single one of these changes just one variable while keeping everything else anchored. A product pivot means you keep your target market anchored, but you swap out the product you're offering them. A use case pivot? That's keeping the underlying technology anchored, but applying it to a totally different problem for that same market. Then you have a market pivot, which takes the exact same product and shifts it to a brand new audience. And then there are the zoom pivots. A zoom-in pivot happens when one single highly successful feature of your product becomes the entire focus of the whole company. Meanwhile, a zoom-out pivot is the exact opposite. It's realizing your product is actually just one feature of a much larger, holistic solution you need to build. In every single scenario, you are keeping one foot planted in reality so you don't lose your balance. Finally, let's head into Section 4, Anticipating Financial Pivot Points, Anchoring the Market. Now we're going to see how day traders use this exact same framework to navigate the absolute chaos of global financial markets. The truly crucial point on a trading chart is the central P or pivot line. It's a median reference point calculated directly from the previous day's high, low, and closing prices. By setting up this mathematical anchor, traders can then plot out resistance lines above it, R1 and R2, and support lines below it, which are S1 and S2. If the market is trading above that pivot, it could indicate bullish sentiment. If it's below, well, probably bearish. Price naturally fluctuates, testing those resistance levels multiple times, maybe reversing, and eventually breaking out, with old resistance often turning into brand new support. But listen, here is the absolute most important takeaway for this financial tool. Pivot points are anticipatory. They are not predictive. They aren't some magic crystal ball because you just can't predict the markets. But what a pivot point actually does is give a trader a fixed, concrete reference baseline to inform their market bias. It lets them anticipate multiple potential outcomes, manage their risk effectively, and execute a solid plan when an actual opportunity arises. And honestly, that brilliantly illustrates the core truth of the pivot, right? Whether you're sweating on a basketball court, engineering a massive irrigation system, sorting a massive database, running a lean startup, or day trading stocks. To make a successful move, you first have to have a point of stability. So, I want to leave you with this one final thought. As you navigate the inevitable changes, the setbacks, or the big opportunities in your own life or career, what is the fixed point you are anchoring to? What is your validated learning, your core value, or your baseline that allows you to confidently step into the unknown? Thanks so much for watching this explainer, and keep learning.